mobility rocks. Shared mobility rocks.
Sixth session, almost halfway.
Yeah, let's give a short intro about Shared Mobility Rocks for those who just entered this 24 hours event.
Yes, it is. So we are Jeffrey and Angelo. Angelo, you are working for Taxistop?
Yes, I am working for Taxistop indeed. I will show you next slides. Oop. So I'm working for Taxistop. This is a Belgian organization, an NGO, operating shared mobility, but mainly working on awareness about more sustainable and shared mobility. Jeffrey, what are you doing?
I am working for autodealer.net, and just to be sure, I am the left one. Angelo is the right one. And we like to promote shared mobility. And shared mobility rocks, what is it all about, Angelo? Tell us.
Yes, it's already the third edition of Shared Mobility Rocks. Two previous editions before Corona, physical events. We thought, let's create some rocking vibes because shared mobility is the most rocking mode of transport. And by organizing this event, we want to have more livable and accessible cities and regions. And we believe that if we connect shared mobility to other modes of transport, sustainable modes of transport, that we can make transport in general more sustainable. And for this COVID event, 24 hours around the world, we want to have a little bit of impact in every part of the world.
Yes, and we mean that literally. In this 24 hours, we present 10 countries with 12 local studios and more than 70 speakers all over the world. And as far as the participants are concerned, a lot of different countries.
Yes,
Angelo.
very exotic. Even Belgium is participating, United States. But
Yeah.
besides that, 63 other different countries are participating to this event. Plus 1,000 participants. And yeah, you know it because we have asked it to you when you registered. But we know your favorite rock songs. We have put them in a Spotify list, and now you can listen to more than 40 hours of favorite rock songs coming from all over the world.
Yes, and because we are in the city of Ghent for 24 hours, the world capital of shared mobility, we're going to do the tour of Ghent. And we have a lot of intermezzo's also. And one of them is the tour of Ghent. We will compete each other as a team. And the one who drives the most kilometers with the bike in 30 minutes is the winner. And you can vote for the winner. And if you vote right, you can be the proud owner of a collector's item. Shared Mobility Rocks socks. So, with enough said by us, and
Mobility rocks.
yeah, yes, it's rock. With enough said by us, we proudly give the words to Ellen Partridge. How do you feel? Do you feel the vibes already? Do you like it?
We love shared mobility rocks. At the Shared Use Mobility Center, we are all about shared assets and shared journeys. All about mobility for access and equity and getting to see your friends and getting your food and getting to go to work sometimes and school. So yeah, so we're all about shared mobility, and the rocks part of it even better. So I think it's really impressive that you guys have put this all together. So thanks all at the in Ghent, and to our team at the Shared Use Mobility Center, who has been just fabulous. So Hannah, you want to say a word to begin?
Okay, we will give the word to you from now on for the next 90 minutes. You can do whatever you want. Do your thing. The floor is yours. The world is listening to you. Good luck.
Have fun.
Thank you so much. That was so fun. What a welcome. Thank you everyone for joining for session 6, Decarbonizing Transportation Beyond Electrification. We're so excited for our speakers. And I want to first introduce Ellen Partridge, who's our Director of Strategy and Policy here at the Shared Use Mobility Center. And I will pass it over to her to kick it off.
All right. Shared mobility rocks for sure. And we have such an incredible panel of experts today to talk. So first we have Reagan Patterson, who is a PhD and the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, Black Caucus Foundation. So I think it's really of note that the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation thinks that transportation is sufficiently important and central that they have a fellow just for that. So it will be wonderful to hear from Reagan, who also has been in the academic community before working on equity issues. Our next speaker will be Ashley Giorgio, who is a staff air pollution specialist with the California Air Resources Board, where she works on equity pilot projects. And then we have Sebastian Castellanos, who is with NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance, where he works on understanding trends in new mobility and how that fits in with transportation emissions and how the whole system works together. So let me tell you just a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. First, each of our three speakers is going to talk for 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll have an ad roll here in the United States about electrification, and so you'll get to take a look at that ad, and then our speakers will respond to that ad about electrification and why we are really going beyond electrification. So following that, then the third part, we have audience participation in selecting items from the jukebox. So we have 5 songs in the jukebox, and you get to vote on which ones are the ones you're most interested in. They're associated with topics that we'll talk about. So the top 3 out of the 5 will win. We also do have a chat box open, so you can send in your comments and questions in that fashion too. So our 3 speakers, again, we're going to start with Reagan, and then Ashley, and then Sebastian.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. My name, as mentioned, is Dr. Reagan Patterson. I am the Transportation Equity Research Fellow at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in Washington, D.C. And the CBCF Center for Policy Analysis and Research identifies, analyzes, and disseminates policies and policy-related information critical to African Americans. And within that, the Transportation Equity Program conducts policy analysis and research as it relates to transportation, sustainability, and equity, with a particular focus on the Black community. While this is the objective of the CBCF in this work, it also speaks to my personal motivation in doing this work. So for instance, the emphasis on sustainability for me raises the question of how Black community members can be part of sustainability's focus on futures. Or stated another way, how do we ensure livable futures, particularly livable Black futures? Now, this is a jukebox style event, so in thinking of a song that connects with me, my motivations, and this work, my mind goes to I Can't Breathe by American R&B singer Her. This song was released during last year's summer uprising against police brutality. And in the hook, Her sings, quote, I can't breathe, you're taking my life from me. I can't breathe, will anyone fight for me? As Dr. Robert Bullard, the father of environmental justice, stated in an interview with The Intercept, whether we can't breathe because of toxic pollution or policing, it's the same systemic racism that is killing us. When asked in a Vice interview, how do you see the Black Lives Matter movement intersecting with environmental justice? Dr. Bullard responded, quote, the way I see it, it's just one movement. If you're talking about Black Lives Matter, it's about racial justice. In Louisiana, 30 years ago, there were 15 plants around one community and people were saying, we can't breathe. We have protest signs from decades ago that look like they could have been made this past summer. So when Her asks, will anyone fight for me? I hear that as a call for livable Black futures. And my particular contribution is helping to ensure climate and environmentally just futures. I come to transportation equity work from an academic focus on environmental justice, as Ellen mentioned. I earned my PhD in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. My dissertation research focused on air quality, sustainable transportation, and environmental justice. More specifically, I modeled the impact of transportation and land use policies on air quality and environmental justice outcomes. So at the CBCF, I make sure to bring attention to both climate and and air pollution implications of transportation. And this necessitates addressing transportation comprehensively. With regard to climate change, according to the US EPA, transportation accounts for the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, 28%. Climate change is happening and the impacts are being felt now. This was made abundantly clear the past few weeks as extreme weather events and fossil fuel infrastructure led to millions of people in the US being without power, heat, food, and water. This disproportionately impacts the vulnerable and disenfranchised, including people of color, low income, sick, elderly, differently abled, unhoused, and incarcerated. And these impacts are on top of those already being experienced because of COVID-19. While the news is primarily now focused on what went wrong, frontline community members are still facing impacts. Audria R. Walker recently tweeted, quote, 3 weeks without water in Jackson, Mississippi. The blackest city in the Black state in the country has been without water for 3 weeks, and it's being paid dust by the rest of the country. People are suffering, no water following a weather emergency, homes were damaged, we're in a pandemic, people don't have jobs, and no water. Now add on top of these climate-induced impacts the air pollution impacts from energy and transportation. In terms of recent weeks, oil and gas facilities shut down due to the freezing weather. Whenever they shut down or start up, these facilities emit huge amounts of air pollution. And in the US, these facilities are disproportionately sited in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, which is a cause for concern about health impacts from toxic air pollution. Additionally, a recent Harvard study found that 18% of total global deaths, or 8.7 million, or 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, resulted from fossil fuel particulate matter emissions. In the US, there are 350,000 premature deaths per year from fossil fuel particulate matter. Air pollution from the fossil fuel industry kills people each year, and marginalized communities on the front line bear the brunt of this. This includes racial disparities in exposures to traffic-related air pollution and consequently disparate health impacts. So again, when the CBCF addresses transportation, sustainability, and equity, it is really pursuing livable Black futures. Our interest in decarbonizing transportation is due to the human consequences that we are already facing. And we have a particular interest in shared mobility because we recognize that attaining this goal of livable futures requires a reimagining of the transportation system, and shared mobility is part of that vision. So I look forward to discussing this vision further with the panel today.
Thank you, Reagan. That's really, really interesting that you're undertaking this work at a time when the administration in the United States seems poised to take some more action than it has in the past few years. Next, Ashley is going to talk about what they're doing in California, and California is a real leader in these.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Regan, as well. Just such impactful commentary. So hello, everyone, and thank you for jamming with me at Shared Mobility Rocks. For those rock band fans out there, this one's for you. My name is Ashley Giorgio, and I work for the California Air Resources Board in the Mobile Source Control Division. I'm a woman of the 80s where big hair, leopard print, and rock music were thick in my blood. I drove old cars with 8-track players and was part of a generation where music defined the journey. Our journey today will provide you with some insights for strengthening the transportation future, one that is equitable and, of course, focused on zero emission. My hope is that through our dialogue, we can dissect what decarbonization of the transportation system really means, why this conversation today, as well as the incredible collaboration that spans these world boundaries, is just so important. So today is about rethinking policies, programs, infrastructure, and how we do things in the transportation space. It's an introspective process, so looking within us at times what's worked well, what can be done better, and what direction we are headed in on the path to shared and clean mobility. Next slide, please. So today, I bring with me regulatory and incentive program experience. I've dealt with both the carrots and the sticks of transportation and climate programs more generally. So for the last 5 years or so, I've been the staff lead for CARB equity policy, specifically in the clean transportation and mobility space. Though I also try to do my best to support multiple other CARB programs, such as our light duty projects, mobile source programs, and incentive funding, as well as the decision-making around that for where we invest in our communities. Also not listed here, but very important, is workforce training and career development. both in the light duty as well as heavy duty vehicle market applications. I'm also leading a really innovative car share and mobility hubs project in the Bay Area, which I'd love to share more details with folks who are interested. We developed a needs assessment process and are implementing shared mobility services based on that needs assessment. So we're really looking at things like discounted transit passes, bike share, car share, based on those community identified needs. What drives me in this position, but most importantly in life, is that desire to promote and embrace change and innovation. I want to get people where they need to go, make options more readily available, but with affordable prices, and directly provide benefits that will match those most critical needs, as mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So before sharing the work at CARB, I wanted to provide the mission and the leadership, because I think this helps to provide everyone with a little bit more context on what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So first, CARB is a public state agency that was put into place to protect and promote public health, welfare, and ecological resources as well. So how do we do this? It's such a huge undertaking. Through effective reduction of air pollution, such as greenhouse gas emissions, but not limited to that, while recognizing and considering what kinds of effects or impacts this has, for example, on the economy of our state. We are one of the world leaders in climate change programs and oversee all air pollution control efforts within California, such as in our port cities and also within industrial facilities. The goal of these efforts is to attain strict air quality standards and maintain those standards over time. That's the challenge. So we develop regulations, which I call the sticks, as well as the incentive carrots to really maximize the benefits of our emission reduction programs. We're working to promote reduced greenhouse gas emissions across sectors and put measures in place as well to provide and measure socioeconomic benefits. So what am I talking about here? Access to jobs, housing, and other quality of life measures. Next slide. So here, I just wanted to highlight that CARB has a really broad, complex incentive portfolio, of which I cannot cover in 3 to 5 minutes today, but I wanted to highlight that this really does bring the cleanest transportation options to the state. They provide greenhouse gas reductions, criteria, toxic, and other pollution benefits that are intended to be complementary with one another. So today, what I'm going to focus on in my presentation and dialogue with you all is that we are focused on our low carbon transportation program. That's part of what we're focused on for mobility. It's intended to reduce GHGs and provide direct benefits to priority populations, so low income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. Okay, so in implementing our clean transportation incentives, we work to improve the well-being of those that we serve. We're in turn contributing to overall shift and an evolution in how we think about clean mobility and how it's critical in meeting our clean transportation and our zero emission goals as set forth by the government of California. So through these efforts, we don't just focus on technology change. We all know that's important. And we're not just focused on clean vehicles either, which is equally important. We're working to build climate resilience, and I think that's really key to today's discussion. We want to make communities more independent and part of the solution to addressing climate change. Next slide. So our focus in the clean transportation incentive space is to develop and support projects. And these are big, large-scale projects as well as small-scale in priority communities. We're focused on the rural, the urban, as well as tribal communities. And we work directly hand in hand with residents to overcome the biggest barriers we've found to accessing clean transportation and also shared mobility, including biking, car share, bike share, things like van pooling and carpooling, innovative transit, and even ride-on-demand services, including within some of the biggest affordable housing developments of the state. Next slide. So in my group, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things here. We focus on vehicle purchase incentives and clean transportation and mobility projects. These are really intended to increase access, affordability, as I mentioned earlier, convenience, as well as expanding options to meet community identified needs. One new part of our incentive portfolio that's highlighted here is that we are now providing funding as an organization for conducting needs assessments in communities, which is a huge step forward. It really allows these communities to do a deeper dive into the critical mobility needs of the residents themselves. But it also really helps to better match the needs with the actual investments that we're making, which is a really huge step in the right direction. Also critical here, I never want to underemphasize this, is outreach and education. We want to increase awareness and exposure, including to zero emission vehicles, and provide more hands-on technical assistance to really allow communities, especially those that are completely unfamiliar with our programs and even grant writing, for example. We want them to be able to apply for our programs. So we promote community level capacity building in hopes that these investments that we're making are really here to stay. And we do not want to leave community residents stranded, so to speak, with less options down the line. We've worked to streamline our grant and incentive processes, but we envision that more needs to be done, which is part of the reason why we're here today. So I just want to say with that, let's go to the next slide. We do have a lot of programs and projects, so I'll highlight that, and I don't want to take up too much time away from the other esteemed colleagues on the panel. I just wanted to say that we have vehicle purchase incentives, which are highlighted here. A lot of investment's been happening. These are really just visual takeaways for both of you on this slide as well as the next slide, just so that you guys can understand kind of the scope, depth, and breadth of what we focus on. And I think with that, we can pass it to Sebastian, and thank you, Ellen.
Ashley, that was terrific. There's just so much going on in California. We could listen to that a long, long time. But we are also very happy to hear from Sebastian. And I should just mention, Sebastian has gone to school in more different countries than I don't know. It's he's obviously learned a lot and will give us some of.
Awesome. Thank you, Ellen, and thanks, Ashley and Reagan, for sharing your story with us. It's super interesting. So, you know, I just started putting a couple of slides together just to show you a bit of how I got to where I am right now. So I titled this presentation My Way. As Ashley, I'm also a child of the 80s, but I have to say I'm a bit more into 60s, 70s rock music. So, you know, Jefferson Airplane, the Byrds, Mamas and the Papas, all of that. That's what I like. But, you know, I would argue that Frank Sinatra is actually, you know, an original rock star here. So next slide. So very quickly, I was born in Bogota in Colombia, and this is really what my experience of transportation was for the first 16 years of my life. It was really all these old buses, really chaotic, and just just cement all over the place. And the first experience, and here's the first act of my story that really changed my perception of transportation was, next slide. When Bogota, it's really when I started university, and when Bogota really was making a lot of changes to its transportation system. So this, probably maybe some of you know about this. This is the BRT system in Bogota. It's called Transmilenio. And it's something that really, really changed the face of the city. This is close to where I used to live back home. And it's a statement in itself, right? This picture, you can see that it's a statement that the city was making, saying like, even if you own a car, it's fine. You can still use your car, but we're going to start investing in transportation systems that are for the people, not just for all those few that own a car. And this, again, this is a huge statement because it tells you, if you're in this bus, you're actually more important than if you're just driving your car. We're going to give you more space. We're going to give you space and, to use it. And we're going to give you space to, and time, and we're save time from your day. So this really changed my perception of the city, changed my perception of the transportation system, and it really allowed me to save so much time going to university. Next slide. This is the second thing. So when I went to university, as I mentioned, I went to university in Colombia, in Bogota, and I actually took a very different path to, I guess, many of the people that are here. But I have a degree in engineering, in electronic engineering. So, not planning or not transportation, it's electronics. But while I was there in university, I took this class that to me was, very, very new. It was called Green Businesses. And the first thing we did in this class was, and this was, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago, I can't remember, 2007, maybe it was some time ago. And the first thing we did in this class was we watched An Inconvenient Truth, that documentary that, maybe some of you have seen. And this is really where I got bit by that bug of working for the environment, and this is something that I've dedicated my career to doing, and really trying to figure out how we can decarbonize the transport sector and decarbonize many of our activities. So this is kind of like the second act in my story, where I really understood what my calling was. Next slide. This is the third act. This is the first bicycle I was able to buy with my own salary. It was a folding giant bike. And it, again, as the BRT system had changed my perception of the city, this really flipped it all over the place. It allowed me to experience the city very differently. It allowed me to experience the city from a bike, which is such a different way of experiencing a city than just looking at the front of your car. And I haven't stopped using this. This was my first bike like 10 years ago, and from that day on, I've just commuted by bike every single day. Even when I moved to DC, which was 5 years ago, I remember my first winter. It was in the tens or maybe close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. I still biked that day because I just enjoy it so much. Next slide. And finally, and Ellen was telling you guys about how I've been I've studied all over the world, and this is something that that happened while I was doing my master's in transportation planning in the UK. We did a road trip to one of the national parks in the UK. And everyone was asleep in the car except me. And I was listening to this podcast by the BBC, BBC4 here, on the sharing economy. And again, this was several years ago, before the sharing economy was a big thing, or shared mobility was a big thing. I was just completely fascinated by this concept of the sharing economy. And that again changed something in my mind that allowed me to really understand how this could be different, how the transportation system could change, and how this would be a very, very good tool for all of us to move towards more sustainability. And this is where I am right now. So this is, I've been doing a lot of work around shared mobility with Numo right now, but also I'm doing my PhD part-time, and my topic is governance of shared mobility. So this is really my passion. It's my work, and it's something that I work, every day. I'm thinking constantly about this topic. So yeah, this is me in 4 acts.
And we are hopeful that shared switch gets turned on in other people, and this panel will certainly help that happen. So we want to focus our conversation a little bit on beyond electrification, but as an introduction to that, we do have an ad from the Super Bowl that we'll play for you, and our folks are All right, so I hope you all could see that, and now to comment on the make-believe world of car commercials or beyond electrification. We'll start with Reagan, and then Sebastian, and then talk among yourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I do apologize if you hear the drum circle in the back. It's a nice day in DC, and so I live across the street from a park, and so there's a drum circle happening right now. So my apologies. But back to this commercial. And so one kind of issue from the standpoint of the CBC is that this focus on electric vehicles perpetuates the single occupancy automobile dominated transportation system, which limits mobility. And so it does nothing to address that. For instance, in the US, low income Black households spend 30% of their pre-tax income on transportation, or that 20% of Black households don't have access to an automobile, and 1/3 of low income African Americans actually live in a zero vehicle household. It does nothing to redress, but actually relies on a transportation infrastructure such as highways that have adversely impacted Black communities and heighten the risk of pedestrian injuries. Moreover, it does not acknowledge or contribute to the fact that almost 1 in 4 public transit riders are African American. And so while electric vehicles do address greenhouse gas and toxic air pollution emissions, the stats and experiences point to the need for a new transportation model that shifts away from this car-centric to prioritizing shared mobility and public transit.
Ashley, thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Reagan. I definitely agree with many of your statements. And in spite of my love of Will Ferrell, this ad for me sheds light on the problem in clean transportation discourse. For one, it's very narrow, it's one-sided, it makes us seem very competitive with our other partners across the world, and I think we all need to work collaboratively to meet our goals. That said, there is one thing, I guess, I always try to find the positive in all the negative. So this does show the role that people of influence can play in changing attitudes and potentially even behavior. So now what we need is an ad with Will Ferrell getting on a bike, and then I might feel a little bit better about it. Also, it's kind of interesting because they're talking about flying to Norway, so there's no recognition of their overall carbon footprint, even if you're driving an EV. So I had to throw that out there. Sebastian, what are your thoughts?
So yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that you've said so far. I think, to me, I'm gonna be completely honest. I hate this ad really bad. It's just, I cringe every time I see it. But in particular, I've been doing a lot of work around electrification for the past 5 years. And I've seen how this is a topic that very few people were talking about a few years ago to a topic of everyone's mind. And I think, that is important in itself, because I think it's something that allows people to really have, again, a different experience with the transportation sector. So going back to your point, Ashley, of trying to find positives in this ad, I do think that's it. People are definitely interested in this, and it's something that's, top of mind, at least for people. But on the flip side, I totally agree with what Reagan was saying. We really need a complete shift in the transportation system. The US is so car-centric at the moment, but the US is not the center of the world. There's so many other places around the world that also have different experiences with transportation. And perhaps going back to my experience in Colombia, in Bogota, for example, only 15% of the population owns cars. So even if we all go electric, or if everyone in Bogota goes electric, I mean, that's such a small part of the problem. But even so, even if we're talking about the US where so many people own cars, are we just going to continue perpetuating this, unjust system that is happening right now, where we're just taking over land to build highways and building, infrastructure for cars? Or are we really thinking about shifting completely that pattern? So we're really, I feel, at a crossroads at this moment, and electrification is not going to get us there. We really need a huge shift.
So the commercial certainly made us think about the variety of things that we find objectionable about it. I think the one line in there where one of the people asked, "Why don't we go together?" And I was like, "No!" And we're like, "Oh, such a wrong answer." There's research showing that when people think about taking a car going somewhere with a car, they underestimate how long it will take them to get there. And when they think about taking that trip by walking, they overestimate how long it will take to get there. So there really are lots of shifts in perception and reality that we need to be looking at. So I think, especially as the new administration here is looking at, how do we electrify as many things as we can, but how do we also go beyond electrification in the transportation system? So, Sebastian, any comments for our other panelists or others?
No, I mean, maybe we can start with the rare songs. I don't know.
I have a quick question, Ellen. Did we want to show the visuals for Beyond Transportation Electrification now, or is that going to come after audience participation? Because we had 2 slides that I could walk through just very, very briefly that cover a couple other points.
Oh, that would be fabulous. Yeah, why don't you do that now?
Okay. So Hannah, hopefully you don't mind pulling those up. So one of the things I wanted to share here is actually a quote, which I thought was hugely helpful to kind of help center us in this conversation. And it's rock related as well, of course. So it says, if music is a place, then jazz is the city, folk is the wilderness, rock is the road, and classical is a temple. And that's by Verza Nazarene. And the reason I wanted to bring up this quote is that the road before us really requires strategic thinking. So both of what we've done in the past and what communities have faced when it comes to things like redlining, poor air quality, and living conditions, as well as the future, and how we can master the challenging puzzle of equity. And that's really in order to promote broader options, but also to improve access and the overall well-being of the communities that we serve. So the second, before I go to the second visual, hang on, let me scroll up for a second. So being on the road, to me, means that there's a path traveled, and that electrification is but one part, as many of my colleagues already mentioned, of a broader ecosystem of zero emission. And that's really what we're looking for when it comes to a cleaner transportation reality. So with that, I'll move on to the next visual. Sorry, Hannah. So why do states and countries need to think beyond transportation electrification? So in my eyes, the answer is very simple, though there's many complicated facets that go along with it. So in order to meet our climate and equity goals, we can't just rely on one method. It's not going to work. As you saw in the ad, there's focus on new vehicles. Most communities cannot afford new vehicles, let alone electric vehicles. So our air quality and climate change challenges really involve complex decision-making, and electrification is just not the panacea for that. We want to reduce petroleum dependence to protect our populations, but equally promote economic growth and development. So what this requires is a delicate and careful balance. We need to be creative to meet unique needs of our most impacted communities as well, and offer this really broad array of options that really tie to the needs of the communities. So what it is it's thinking outside of the box and being careful in the investments that we're making. So I wanted to just offer a couple of examples of things that I thought were kind of missing that we should probably highlight in this conversation. Even though electrification is one important means to an end, we also need to think about how we address equity, which means zero emission vehicles may not work in some communities. They may need alternative solutions such as discounted transit passes or pooled shared services to get to their doctor's appointments or to get to school. We also need to promote inclusion, as you see on the slide, and provide the same level of opportunity to folks both in the social aspect as well as economically and environmentally. I thought it was also really interesting too, because we also have to think not just about GHG emissions, but reducing our vehicle miles traveled. Thus, what's missing from the discourse that we've been discussing is that connection between land use, housing, transportation, and even energy. All those things are so intimately connected. So I just wanted to make sure, Ellen, to bring that up, because I think it's a really important part of this discussion. And I'll leave it at that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that we certainly can't ignore the other pollution impacts from automobile travel, and that is from pollution from tires, from asphalt. So all of that goes into and affects communities disproportionately. And finally, I think we just also need to think about the timing. So the UN climate change panel says we really need to take a lot more action before 2030. So 2050 is a nice goal to get to zero, but we have to act more quickly. With cars having a useful life of around 11 years, you just have to move more quickly with other kinds of ways of reducing vehicle miles traveled. I think we should start thinking a lot more about PMT rather than VMT, passenger miles, as the thing that we want. It's not that we want the cars to be able to go places. We want people to be able to go places. Any other comments before we turn to our poll? Okay, so we have a poll on menti.com. The code Hannah is putting in the chat box, and we have 5 choices. So I'm looking to see. Here they come. All right, so we have, hold on a sec. We have 5 choices, we have 5 songs. Let me tell you what the songs are associated with. So the first song is Imagine. And we want to imagine, how do we make transit and shared mobility work better? That's that topic of conversation. The second one, If I Could Turn Back Time, is about how do we repair the inequities and problems that transportation infrastructure has created in the past. So in the United States, highways have cut through communities, often minority communities, because property values were lower and political power was less. So if we could turn back time, how would we repair the inequities? Third song, Money, Money, Money. What financial incentives would work to make shared use more attractive? What carrots and sticks? Is it free transit? Is it a carbon tax? Is it a VMT tax? What about the money? And the next one is, what's greenhouse gases got to do with it? And this is, how can the incentives used for electrification be extended to shared use? Can we get a climate check that lets us use, instead of just buying an electric vehicle, lets us use that same amount of money or some other amount of money to do something that reduces greenhouse gases in a different way, because it's not just electrification. And finally, Electric Avenue. Why do we need to go beyond electrification? What are the types of system changes that we need? So I see we have a great deal of. So we're gonna choose the top 3. We'll give it another half a minute for any voting. There we go with Imagine. All right, going once, going twice. All right, so we're going to start off with If I Could Turn Back Time. So we're going to play a few bars from the song. Okay, I know we've all touched on this subject a bit in our introductory remarks, but who'd like to start?
I'm happy to go. Yeah, I think we did touch a bit on this point. I would perhaps like to, going back to our discussion around beyond electrification, And I think really what we need to do at this point is shifting investment priorities. Like, this is really something that this shift with investment priorities is what dictates what is going to happen. And I work with one of the pioneers of shared mobility, Robin Chase. She was the co-founder of Zipcar. And she has this phrase that I absolutely love because it's so true. And her phrase is, infrastructure is destiny. So if we continue building infrastructure that is inequitable, that is for cars, then yeah, that's what we're going to get. So my first take on this is really, if we shift priorities and investments and start investing in what will be more equitable and more sustainable infrastructure, then that's what we'll get in the future.
If there has been disinvestment in communities in the past, then it would seem that they should be prioritized for investment with the new Build Back Better.
Yes, and I'll add on to that conversation around investments. And so I guess we can start with how we even got here, and how we got to this automobile-dominated transportation system. And so, kind of piggybacking off of what Sebastian said, it was because of freeway investment and public transit disinvestment that really paved the way for the current state of transportation. And so this definitely had inequitable consequences when we look at where this freeway infrastructure was put in terms of communities, the demolition of communities. And so we see, and who this infrastructure was meant to serve. And so freeways were not built to serve all equitably. When we talk from a US standpoint, it was built to serve white flight. And so again, which contributed to disinvestment from urban cores. And so just wanting to point out that it's this historical, but also contemporary investments, because as we see currently in transportation investments, you still have the prioritization of freeways and major roadways over public transit and other mobilities. For instance, federally, you see that 80% of federal transportation dollars go to freeways and major roadways, and only 20% goes to public transit. And so, as Sebastian said, with the quote on infrastructure, if you continue to invest in that infrastructure, that is the transportation system we're going to continue to have. But in recognizing the need for a shift and a reimagining and a remodeling of our transportation system, that's going to require a reprioritization of those funds.
So there is a growing movement to say, instead of spending 80% of our transportation dollars from the federal government on highways and 20% on transit, we should make it 50-50. And Representative Garcia from Illinois has introduced a bill to that effect. So changing mindset about that. Actually, comments?
Oh, just briefly, just a comment. So that is actually called the Transit Parity Resolution that was introduced, and there's a growing number of people who are on that. And so we'll see if it gains more traction. But yes, that is the Transit Parity Resolution, if anyone is interested in exploring that.
Yeah, I definitely second the comments made on investments. One of the things that we're working on at CARB is looking at where we can see that there are big gaps, where we know we need to do more, and how we can reach those hard to reach communities. So I think that's definitely going to be a priority for our agency going forward. To go back to my introductory presentation, I just wanted to highlight that I do think we need a healthy mix of carrots and sticks. I don't necessarily think we can only have one or the other. Incentives are valuable, but regulations also play a really important role if they're done well, and if they're centered in inclusion of the community in the process. Also, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that I've experienced based on kind of being on the ground in communities implementing programs. So one of them is that we definitely see a desire and a need for free and subsidized transit. It works in some communities, it doesn't always work. But we've been seeing that in the elderly population, for example, we need to make sure there's more outreach, because many folks don't even know that these options exist to them, even if they are really desperate for finding alternative modes to personal vehicle use. So we've been really working on how we can improve our outreach and education there. But I also just wanted to highlight that from our perspective, we can't just have incentives like car share. We've got to have these other options that are available. I do think it's worth exploring taxes. I previously used to work on the cap and trade program, so there is definitely value in those types of models. I just think we have to be very careful. So my caution would be that things like, let's just use something from the UK, congestion pricing, for example. There are a lot of really great intentions behind that, and I think it works well. But there are also the negative impacts on the equity side for folks that need to access the city as part of their employment who might come from an underserved community. So we have to think through the full life cycle of the decisions that we're making and how they impact people downstream. And that was all. Thank you, Ellen.
Yes, and I think that it's worth pointing out also that some models from other cities, like in Bogota, Transmilenio, and other cities in South America, were really instrumental in pioneering a kind of transportation that has come to some United States cities and some cities elsewhere that is really, really powerful and much less expensive than subways. But again, to your point, it really is important to look at, how all the pieces of it fit together.
I'm just going to make a comment on what Ashley was saying about the carrots and the sticks. And I think, to me, policy definitely it has the biggest role here in this, right? Like when you're defining where you're going to make investments, it's these are policy decisions. So, I think many times we're shifting the blame. And for example, in this car commercial, it's not very clear. Like we're shifting the blame. We're saying like, oh, consumers are like, no one's going to change consumers. Consumers want big cars. Consumers want EVs. But actually, it is policy that will have a big effect in directing some of these, both investments and consumer preferences. And just, I would like to highlight a small example of this that is probably going to happen, and I think Reagan, maybe you'll have a bit more information on this. But Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Senate Democrats, he has this bill that he wants to pass on incentivizing the purchase of EVs, kind of like a cash for clunkers program. And he had earmarked, I think it's close to $600 billion. And again, like just think about what we could do in cities and improving transportation systems for everyone, instead of providing some incentives for a few that can't afford electric vehicles. So yeah, I think, going back again to your point, Ellen, we're I guess making inroads in people's minds, but still we have so long to go.
You should think about a climate check, where you could get a check and use the money for something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that wouldn't have to be an electric vehicle or a single occupancy vehicle. Well, I think this brings us to our next song, which is Imagine, Transit and Shared Mobility Working Together. So how do we make transit and shared mobility work better with dedicated right-of-way, reliable service, more frequent service? But let's have a few bars of Imagine. Always a pleasure. And the contrast of that song and the advertisement that we saw. Who'd like to start?
On this one. So I think one of the things I wanted to mention here is that we need to first understand the lived experiences of the community residents. I think oftentimes we've seen this as programs are developed. We rely on the community members to come up with all the solutions to these historic and systemic problems. And I think that's backwards. I think we need to work with them on solutions and understand that the residents themselves are really the experts. They've been living and breathing the air in these communities. They know what things need to be done. Also, just wanted to note that, we have to recognize the missteps of the past. And I think what that means is realizing, as I said in my presentation, we can and we will do better as a society to meet our goals, but we have to be patient. I think it's important. We have to put the right policies and investments in place, as my colleagues had already mentioned. We also have to be really careful because as we're going through and doing these projects, we need to make sure that as, for example, we're realizing the benefits or disbenefit that we can make adjustments. I'm always a proponent to admit when things are not working as expected, as long as you can make those mid-course adjustments, learn from the data, share those lessons learned with other people. I think that is super, super important. I think looking at things like qualitative data and figuring out what kinds of impacts we're actually having will go a long way in addressing a lot of the inequities that we've been seeing across the world. So I'll leave it with that to give my other folks on the panel some time.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to uplift something that Ashley has been emphasizing, and I really appreciate you emphasizing this, Ashley, the need for community, not just engagement, but really having at least a degree of self-determination in solutions. And so as I like to reference Bernice King, she tweeted, "We need to change who owns and controls the table." So the sense of not just pulling up a chair to the table, but who is really guiding the decision-making process. And so I do want to uplift that, because I definitely appreciate Ashley's comments around that. And then additionally, in terms of imagining transit and shared mobility working together, to kind of get into that, in my earlier statements around the ad, I mentioned how almost 1 in 4 public transit riders are African American. And so when we talk about transit and shared mobility, I have the perspective that we really need to integrate shared mobility services with public transportation. And so what are we doing to ensure that there's easy accessibility to bike share and scooter share docking stations co-located at bus stops, at rail stations, to really improve this connectivity? And what are we doing to also ensure that shared mobility options are available in areas underserved by mass transit? And so earlier, one of the fellow panelists mentioned van pools and things like that. And so how can we ensure that van share options, for instance, are available from public housing to essential services such as grocery stores, employment centers? And so these are kinds of the things that I'm talking about when I say reimagining, making sure that people have access to mobility options, but also access to essential services. And so really thinking of how shared mobility complements and supplements public transit to get at this imagining them working together.
In a lot of ways, I think we have to imagine how public transit can work better, that it is reliable and clean and fast. And so ways to make that all work together. We think of public transit as shared mobility, that there are just like many parts of transit. And so bikes and scooters, we want assets and shared journeys to make the world of transportation a better place.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with what you both are saying. And I think I have this quote here that I pulled up from a study. So I think like we need to imagine it right now because it's not happening, but we don't need to imagine what needs to happen. And the quote that I have here is from this paper from 1979. So we've known for a long time what needs to happen. It says schedule flexibility, cost, safety, and a short wait in traffic are prime factors associated with people shifting from single occupancy vehicles. So we know what needs to happen. And I think exactly what Reagan was saying is what needs to happen. We need to make sure that shared mobility is complementary to all of these things, but we also need to bump up what is happening with transit right now. We need to make sure that it's, there's much more, flexibility for people in terms of time. Just as an example, I'm very lucky because I have a bus stop literally in the corner of where I live. But the bus comes over like every 45 minutes. So it becomes very, very inconvenient for me to use the bus system. So we know what needs to happen. It's just a matter of shifting the priorities, shifting the investment, shifting the mindset of people that are in positions of power to really make these decisions. We don't need to imagine it. We just need to make it happen.
Infrastructure is a really big part of that. So the study I mentioned showing that when people want to walk somewhere, they overestimate how long it will take. Well, there's something that if there are trees along the way, if it's a pleasant way to walk, then they don't overestimate how long it takes. So that is really part of the infrastructure. If you're walking in a narrow space next to a 6-lane highway, it's really different than feeling like you're taking a walk through the park to get to where you're going. Really important how the infrastructure fits in with all of the rest of it.
And then can I add? If I can add, yeah. So something that I'm seeing in the comments and something that I think raises is a great point being raised is the impact of the pandemic. And so I think we all agree on this panel that public transit systems definitely need to increase funding and investment. And we're saying this and having this conversation at a time where we're seeing the exact opposite, at least in the US, where because of the financing structure that's heavily reliant on fare revenue and because of decreased fares, we're seeing public transit systems that are suffering. And so luckily we've had bills that have allowed transit systems to sustain fiscal year 2021, but fiscal year 2022 starts in July, and already transit agencies across the country are saying that they have budget gaps. And so I agree that it does depend on policy and money. Money indicates priorities. And so again, we all agree that transit needs to be a priority. And so the country federally needs to respond with adequate funding for these public transit systems and really looking at that funding structure where it should be seen as a public good that is continually funded by the federal government, not something that is heavily reliant on fare revenues, which then makes them susceptible to any form of disaster and pandemic. We're having this conversation talking about climate change, so they are also susceptible to climate change related disasters, as well as any other future recession or pandemic. And so making sure that they are continually sustained through federal investment dollars.
Yes, and it should be pointed out that to cover operating costs for transit agencies is not actually a new thing. So 4 decades ago, the federal government operating costs for transit agencies, and then they stopped. And so only in the last year with the pandemic have they come back to covering some of the operating costs for transit agencies. And at the same time, one of the things that has become just acutely visible is how much essential workers are the people who are taking transit more during the pandemic. And as we move out of the pandemic, there are just huge questions about what's going to happen with downtowns. Are people going to go to work, 1 or 2 days a week and not 5? What's the impact on that going to be for restaurant workers? How do we think about deliveries and how that impacts transit? So I think that some of the things that are really clear that we want to make transit work, faster, better, cheaper for people, and particularly the people who need it most. I think this brings us to our third. I'm happy to have any comment, but our third most highly voted topic was money, money, money. What financial incentives would work to make shared use more attractive? What are the carrots and sticks that work? So should we have a brief musical interlude here? Okay. All right. Keep that up.
This is kind of building, Ellen, from our last topic, but I think it's relevant. So one of the things I was kind of wanting to mention based on Regan and Sebastian's comments is that funding and incentives, there's a lot of challenges. So we obviously rely on state funding sources. We know that's not sufficient to meet our clean mobility and our equity goals. So we obviously look to federal opportunities, especially for transit. But then even that might not be enough to provide that long-term sustainable funding source we're looking for. So one of the things I just wanted to pose as we're thinking through this question is how we can think through public-private partnerships or other alternative options, because I don't know how we're going to meet our goals. I see funding going down and the need going up. And with that in mind, that's why my presentation was focused on the need for creativity, because I do think we're going to have to come up with some new ideas to address very historic problems. With that said, I also just wanted to highlight a couple of other quick things. So in terms of incentives, what works very, very well, at least from what we've seen in the CARB experience, is car share, carpooling, and van pooling. And as noted in the comments, COVID has definitely impacted all of those services, some more than others. I know some folks are comfortable with shared trips, others are not right now, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But to your point earlier, Ellen, I also think with the van pooling in particular, one of the things that has been really beneficial is we not only see GHG reductions and VMT, but also the PMT reductions. We've seen this, for example, as we had agricultural van pools for the workers within the fields, and bringing so many people to the same workplace who needed to get there and were using their personal vehicles to do so prior to having this option available to them. We've also seen this, for example, in a paratransit type situation, where we have folks with various disabilities who are not able to drive, or maybe don't have a driver's license or unbanked. And we're able to give them some options that get them to their doctor's appointments on time. And so I just wanted to highlight here that these are kind of the community tailored solutions that work well. The challenge is they all can require a lot of funding, and the communities want that on a sustained basis.
Yes, I think certainly paratransit is one of the big changes in the last 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act that has changed how we think about transit and how we provide services. But expanding that concept even more to make sure that people who need access have access. And again, that it's, faster, cheaper, and better. Reagan, you look like you wanted to jump in.
Oh, I was mainly in agreement, but I will jump in terms of barriers. And so something that Ashley brought up was mentioned briefly was unbanked. And so that's something that we're seeing particularly in communities of color. And again, with my work, particularly focusing on Black community. And so in the US, something that actually surprises folks is that 17% of Black households are actually unbanked and 30% are underbanked. And so when we're talking about being able to access these services, that is definitely a huge barrier. And then a lot of these services require a smartphone. And again, something that my friends in conversation are very surprised to find out is that 25% of Black households actually don't have a smartphone. And so how are you going to even use a lot of these services when either you do not have access to a debit or credit card, or you don't have access to a smartphone? And so before we even can have a conversation on incentivizing people to use these services, it's about how can people even have what they need to even be able to use these services. And so that's something that that's something that I've been thinking about personally. You do see some great innovative, Ashley's comment on creativity. I do appreciate that you do start to see a lot of these shared mobility services turning or providing alternative payment options. And so that is something that has increased accessibility. And so that is one thing. And then some of them are also starting to allow you to integrate your transit payment cards with the shared mobility service. And so then that brings us back to another point that Ashley made around communicating so that folks even know that this is an option, that you do have these alternative options, or you do to be able to access these services. And so the points of entry and the barriers to entry are something that is something that's on my mind. And then something that we don't even think about very often, which I brought up in my earlier comments around safety and policing, is that a lot of communities of color do not feel safe using some shared mobility services because of the fear of racial profiling. And so we do have cases, even recently, just a few months after I moved to DC, there was the case of Karan Hilton Brown, who was using a Rebel electric scooter and was actually killed after being chased by police for not wearing a helmet on the electric scooter. And so there's real actual fear of using some of these shared mobility services because of racial profiling and the police interactions that can occur. And so all of these are kind of things that come to mind when I talked about in my introductory statements around looking at transportation holistically. It's, again, how do we address all of these barriers to make sure that people know about and can use safely shared mobility.
Our city of Chicago, there are more tickets given out for bicycles on sidewalks in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods than there are in other neighborhoods. And, you know, lots of, you know, is it about the infrastructure? Is it profiling? Whatever it is needs to be addressed. I would just like, while we have these many people on the line, if you have ideas about incentives that you would like to see, just tap them into our chat box, because we will all look at them and see what we can do with them going forward. But yeah, other comments on our money, carrots and sticks?
I would just like to touch on a point that Reagan was just making, because I've also been thinking quite a bit about this, you know, access piece, and how I think when we talk about access in transportation, I think most people are really thinking about people being able to access, you know, a necessity, people being able to go to the shop, or people being able to go to, you know, that definition of access. But we put together this framework that helps us think about access more holistically when you're thinking about new mobility and shared mobility in particular. And I think it really speaks to what Ashley was saying. So we're defining access right now as not only access to those necessities, but also access to the platforms, which means that everyone can have access to, you know, the information and what they need to get, whether it's by phone, whether it's on their cell phones, or, you know, the access to the platform that opens the shared mobility ecosystem. And then the other thing is also the access to the vehicles, which is the other part when you're thinking about shared mobility, not only having vehicles, you know, in the city center, or, you know, but actually having those vehicles where people need them. And again, going back to one of Reagan's point right now, which is, you know, some of these new shared mobility modes have been doing some experimentation around this, but I do still think that there's still much work to do in that space. And we've seen, for example, these shared micromobility modes like scooters and bikes that, you know, some cities have been putting some requirements for example, for these vehicles to be deployed in certain areas of the city that have been historically underserved by transportation, or being or opening, you know, other, like, not only smartphones, but through regular phones, or not for bank populations, so not using bank cards, but using other means of, for example, rechargeable cards. So, you know, I think there is some experimentation happening here, but there's so much work still that needs to be done. And going back again to Ashley's point, which is, you know, how can we get private and public sector collaboration? This is a perfect place, because this is where, you know, the goals of both the public sector trying to get people into, you know, some of these modes that are definitely more equitable, and the private sector who is interested in expanding, you know, their scope for, again, these micromobility modes, they do convene and they go to, you know, hand in hand. So there is such a big opportunity here to do some joint work, public-private sector together.
To pick up on a point that you made about one of the things that we can measure easily is people's commute trips to work. But those are really only a small part of the trips that people actually take. And so when you think about, you know, how is the transportation system designed, it really is designed, the transit system is designed so that it takes care of the peak in the morning when office workers are going to work, and the peak in the afternoon when those office workers are going home. But there are lots of other trips that are made during the course of the day and night. And so many of the essential workers are taking trips at different times of the day. So what's happened, one of the things that you can see during the pandemic is that those peaks, those morning and afternoon peaks, they have been flattened out. Early on in COVID, we talked about flattening the peak of the infection. Well, the peak of transit has been changed really dramatically. Someone described them as sort of like soft rolling hills now, and not peaks. But that has a lot of implications for how we build the system and how we think about moving as we move sort of post COVID. How do we design and redesign the system?
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of piggyback off of that. I'm so glad you brought up the conversation around non-standard work hours, because that is something that has definitely gotten renewed or emphasized attention during COVID, because when you do have public transit systems that are shutting down earlier because of fare decreases, you're seeing transit workers having to rely on other modes of transportation to get around, which are typically less affordable modes. And so that piece around affordability, when we talk about these different modes of transportation, particularly for our workers who work non-standard hours, and essential workers, and stories. I have friends whose, for instance, roommate is a chef, and so has to spend $40 coming back each day. And so imagine $40 of each paycheck going to you coming home from your job. That's not why you go to work, to just be able to get home. And so it is a substantial amount of money that people are paying because of the disalignment between transit hours and lack of access to other mobility modes, and their work hours. And so that's definitely a point when we talk about equity and transportation equity, something that definitely needs to be addressed.
I'd just like to make a quick plug here for a colleague of mine that I really look up to. I'm just going to share here in the chat a blog post she wrote. It's in Spanish though, but she talks about mobility patterns of women in Latin America, and you clearly see in this that the transportation system, even Latin America, has been built just for commuters, and it's not really taking into account that women in general already have very different mobility patterns. So just a quick plug there, just piggybacking on Reagan's comments.
And in Los Angeles said that during the pandemic, the percentage of riders on public transit who were women went up. So even though more women were actually losing jobs because they had to do more childcare and other kinds of care activities during the pandemic, still there was a larger percentage of women on their buses in Los Angeles. So just really understanding what the patterns are, and then trying to see how do we work on those? How do we address the communities that are actually needing to use transit?
I wanted to add before we stop this piece is that we learned in working with shift workers in San Diego, for example, folks who are working in the hotels primarily, that this actually presented a workforce development opportunity for someone to actually be driving a relatively large van to transport multiple people from their workplace. So I just want to, again, plug the importance of thinking strategically about where people are, where they work, and also what we've seen with COVID. To Sebastian's point earlier is that traditionally we always think of people going to their destinations, but now we do have this shift in what mobility looks like. And that is also making sure that services go to the people. So when it comes to small businesses and delivery drivers, we need to make sure that they have cleaner options. I don't want to see Amazon trucks, taking over neighborhoods, because that's genuinely what COVID has brought in many of these communities, including my own. And so I think we should definitely think about that in the long term.
Say more about your point about delivery services. So you're saying we don't want them taking over the road space?
No, because of the emissions associated with, for example, the Amazon trucks, they have not transitioned their fleet. So They're coming in doing multiple routes, going through very poor communities, and I just don't think we've fully wrapped our heads around what those impacts actually look like yet. This is such a new thing. Everybody's relying on Amazon for the things they used to go purchase themselves at the store. So just something to think about in the long term, because I don't think that's going away.
So we can't underestimate the need for policy, both in how we spend, how we invest our funds, and then how we use and our streets. So there's more and more attention being paid to curb space. Do delivery trucks need to reserve curb space? Do they need to pay for it? How do it just seems like there's a mismatch between the externalities that are being caused, the cost on the public at large, and the cost that people pay to have their packages delivered. So Amazon Prime is just a kind of amazing thing, but it just does not seem like it helps it seems like there are other ways that we can try to consolidate package deliveries so that we don't have 6 packages to the same person in a day.
And before we get off, I do want to comment on John Niles' post regarding why pre-pandemic transit ridership was falling. And so I think that it's a very great comment, and I'm glad that that was brought up. And so it relates so much to what has been said around reliability, connectivity issues. Here in DC, WMATA, actually, which is our transit agency, actually did cuts earlier in 2016, which is before now with the 2020-2021 cuts. And this was because of falling ridership. And so one thing that was commented on in some of the articles, though, was people aren't riding because it's unreliable service. And so it's kind of this cyclical pattern. So it's you cut your transit service, it's less reliable. People don't want to ride, less reliable service. You cut more service. And so what are we going to do to make sure we inject and sustain the level of funding to have connectivity and shared mobility? All their options are part of this conversation around connectivity to ensure that I may use a bike share, go to my transit stop and get on within 10 to 15 minutes. That is what people are looking for, but that again requires investment. And then also, again, to Ashley's point, making sure that it's designed in a way to actually be usable by community members. And so if a community member says, I use public transit to get to the hospital, to get to other health services, to get to school, to get to my job, are we making sure that these bus stops, these rail stations, these shared mobility options are located so that I can easily do that? And so therefore, even think that public transit is an option for me. And so it is, as John Niles commented, a death spiral. And so making sure that we have the investment and the planning and the community engagement to ensure that these systems work for people and are well funded. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, that so there's an issue about whether there's a kind of death spiral for transit if you under invest. The other thing, though, is really how all of the different parts of transportation work together. So the idea of having mobility hubs around transit stations, so that's where you can get your bicycle, you can get your scooter, you can rent a car. So really being able to fine tune the transportation so that you get what you need, and it's not like you have one tool, your car, to do everything from taking your teenagers to their getting your groceries, to traveling by yourself to the drugstore. So really getting that package of transportation options. And I think that as here in the United States, as we look at the things that in the next few months in Washington, to really make our voices heard about electrification is not the only thing that we should be looking at. We want to go beyond electrification. We want to make sure that there are these other other transit and multimodal options, and that attention is being paid to equity and inclusion considerations throughout. We have just a couple minutes left, so if each of you would like to take a minute and give some final thought or great quote of the day.
I do have something in my mind that I want to comment on, and I think it speaks to what Ashley was saying a few minutes ago about the difficulty in implementing policy, and that actually touches on what Reagan was just mentioning, on how this is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like you cut funding to a certain service because people are not using it. But, I think the role really of public officials is not to respond to what is happening, but it's actually creating that future that we want. So the future is not something that is just going to happen, right? The future is something that we're going to create right now, and really us as individuals, as constituents, we're putting our faith in those elected officials to create that future that we want. So it's such a difficult balance between trying to respond to the immediate needs of constituents today, but at the same time trying to create that future that we all want. So I don't have an answer, of course, but it's just something that always plays in my mind, that balance. It's such a difficult balance. But yeah, something that is there. We should be creating that future that we want.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I really appreciate you kind of concluding with that thought of what do we want our future to look like? It's so easy to say what, for instance, is wrong with something. We started by commenting on what was wrong with the ad, but really pivoting to say, this is what's wrong and what are we going to do to then address that? And what do we imagine our transportation system to look like? And so I started this conversation saying that my motivation, again, is livable futures with a particular emphasis on livable Black futures. And so really a transportation system that reduces and eliminates harm and also provides and increases benefits. So we must reduce harm. Ashley brought up the historical context of this transportation system and these historical inequities. And so again, reducing and eliminating that harm that is perpetuated by current policies, and really focusing on policies that provide and increase benefits, particularly shared mobility and public transit. And so I just want to leave kind of piggybacking on Sebastian's, what does that future look like? And again, one that reduces harm and increases benefits.
Ashley, your last comment?
Definitely. So first off, I want to just say thank you to all the speakers. I myself learned a lot today, and I think that's why we're here. We want to learn and we want to grow. First and foremost, do not be afraid to be bold in all of your policy development and the decisions that you're making. You don't know unless you try. So I always like to beg forgiveness. You can ask my leaders at CARB if that's a good or a bad thing. I'm not really sure. But I definitely think you sometimes have to go out on a limb and be willing to take a risk. And usually that risk will pay off. Also, I just wanted to in this space. And what I mean by partnership is looking at the local, state, federal, and beyond levels of how can we collaborate to make the shared mobility future a reality. And I think this is a huge step in that direction with what we're doing today with Shared Mobility Rocks. I think there's a lot of other avenues we can leverage and utilize to make that dream come true, essentially. And so I just want to say thank you to everyone for the great insights. And I definitely have a lot of great takeaways to share with the team.
I think our theme song is Imagine all of the great things. And I want to just thank the organizers at Shared Mobility Rocks and the folks on my team and the folks here who are presenting. So this was really fun and educational. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Really well done. Thanks for using a song, Imagine. Such a beautiful song.
Shared mobility rocks. Shared mobility rocks. Shared mobility rocks. Shared mobility rocks. Woo!